you can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. Find out why. There is an invisible loneliness that almost no one notices. She doesn't make noise, she doesn't ask for help, she doesn't appear in the photos, but she lives there, in the middle of the crowd. Maybe you're surrounded by people and still feel that emptiness that's hard to explain. It's not drama. It's real emotional pain, and it has deep roots. The truth is that social isolation does not always start with being alone. Sometimes it starts with small rejections, with the feeling of not belonging, with that constant impression that you are out of place. And without realizing it, you activate self-protection mechanisms, create a more closed version of yourself, and begin to avoid what you want most: human connection. But here's something that almost no one says: those who don't have friends are not necessarily difficult people. Often it is someone in vulnerability, someone who has learned through repeated experience to develop social hypervigilance and even a kind of learned helplessness. The good news? This can be understood, reconstructed, and transformed into a path of self-knowledge, belonging, and true emotional healing. There is a kind of invisible loneliness that deceives even those who feel it. The person laughs, works, posts photos, chats in the family group, but inside there is an echo. It's that feeling of being physically present and emotionally absent. The body is in the wheel, but the heart is in social isolation. Many people think that loneliness is synonymous with being alone in a dark room. Not always. Sometimes she appears in the middle of the party, in the workplace, even inside the house. Emotional pain arises when there is a lack of true human connection, when there is no room for real vulnerability, only for social masks. And the most curious? The person begins to doubt their own feelings. How can I feel this way if I have so many people around? This doubt deepens the distance and weakens the sense of belonging. This is where a silent cycle begins that sets the stage for the next stage of this process. It may seem exaggerated, but it is not. Social isolation hurts the body. Studies in neuroscience show that the emotional pain of rejection activates brain areas similar to those of physical pain. That is, when you feel excluded, your brain reacts almost as if it has been cut. It's not freshness, it's biology. This explains why invisible loneliness is so tiring. The person wakes up already exhausted, as if you were fighting a battle that no one sees. The lack of human connection generates internal tension, increases social hypervigilance, and keeps the nervous system on constant alert. It's like living with the radar on all the time. A simple practice to start breaking this cycle is to reconnect body and mind. Moderate physical exercise, deep breathing, and even therapeutic reading such as Who Thinks Gets Rich, by Napoleon Hill help redirect focus and strengthen self-knowledge. Because understanding that this pain is real is the first step to starting emotional healing. And there is still a lot behind it. Social isolation rarely begins with a major trauma. Most of the time, it is born from small, almost invisible rejections. An invitation that never comes, a message ignored, a joke that hurts. These micro-disappointments accumulate and feed invisible loneliness without the person realizing it. Every little frustration activates a twinge of emotional pain. The brain registers it as a threat and begins to reinforce self-protection mechanisms. Better not to expose myself. Better not to create expectations. Gradually, vulnerability is stored in a locked drawer, and human connection begins to seem too risky. The problem is that this silent accumulation shapes how you interpret the world. Social hypervigilance grows, and you start to see signs of rejection even where they may not exist. A neutral look becomes criticism, a silence becomes abandonment. And this is exactly where the brain begins to learn something dangerous about relating. After so many micro-disappointments, the brain does what it does best: protect. an almost automatic self-protection mechanism emerges, as if an internal voice were saying, "It's not worth trying." This logic seems rational, but it is often just fear disguised as prudence. And so, invisible loneliness begins to consolidate. The person reduces invitations, avoids exposing themselves, filters words, controls emotions. Vulnerability comes to be seen as weakness, when in fact it is a bridge to human connection. The curious thing is that this defense reduces the risk of rejection, but also blocks any real chance of belonging. It is a shield that protects and isolates at the same time. Over time, the brain associates attempt with pain, reinforcing a pattern close to learned helplessness. The mind concludes, "If I try, I'm going to hurt myself." To start breaking through this, try small acts of courage, starting a simple conversation, accepting a short invitation, sharing something personal gradually. Because understanding the mechanism is only the beginning of emotional healing. When rejection is repeated, something subtle happens. The brain begins to generalize. It is no longer "that person didn't want me," but "no one will want me." This is the beginning of learned helplessness, a silent belief that any attempt at human connection will end in emotional pain. And this further deepens social isolation. The mind starts to save emotional energy. You even think about getting closer, but you give up before acting. Self-protection becomes the standard, and social hypervigilance increases. Each gesture of others is analyzed as a possible sign of new rejection. The world begins to feel less welcoming, and the sense of belonging weakens. To start breaking this cycle, you need to create positive micro-experiences. It could be joining a group with a common interest, taking a face-to-face course, or even starting a brief conversation with someone at work. The goal is not to create great friendships right away, but to reteach the brain that not every approach ends in failure. This is an essential step on the path to emotional healing. And he prepares something even deeper. When social isolation is prolonged, the person creates an external version to survive. He is the strong, independent person who doesn't need anyone. On the outside, everything seems resolved. Inside, invisible loneliness continues to echo. This mask is born as self-protection, but over time it becomes identity. This person avoids showing vulnerability, because they have learned that opening up can generate rejection. So she delivers efficiency, humor, competence, all impeccable, but rarely delivers real feelings. The problem is that without authenticity there is no deep human connection, and without true connection the sense of belonging weakens even more. The first step to dismantling this armor is not to abandon it for good, but to make it more flexible. Start by revealing small safe truths, such as admitting fatigue or sharing a personal opinion. Readings about self-knowledge and emotional intelligence help a lot in this process. Because behind the person there is someone who still wants emotional healing. And this story is far from over. Over time, invisible loneliness begins to shape behavior almost imperceptibly. The person starts to rehearse lines before talking, reviews messages 10 times, and interprets each silence as possible rejection. This social hypervigilance consumes mental energy and further fuels social isolation. Constant emotional pain creates a cycle of self-sabotage. You want human connection, but at the slightest ambiguous sign you retreat for self-protection. A distracted look becomes proof of disinterest, a short answer becomes confirmation that you don't belong. And so the sense of belonging becomes more and more distant. A powerful practice here is to interrupt the automatic narrative. Ask yourself, do I have real proof of this, or am I interpreting it? Writing thoughts in a diary strengthens self-knowledge and reduces internal distortions. Small corrections of perception begin to make room for different experiences, and this changes more than you think. When social isolation sets in, even the weather seems to change pace. The days get too long when you're alone, but the years go by too quickly when you look back. Invisible loneliness creates this strange feeling of stagnation, as if life is happening only in another place. Without consistent human connection, there is a lack of emotional landmarks that give color to memory. Deep conversations, spontaneous laughter, moments of belonging, all of this organizes our perception of time. When these experiences diminish, the routine becomes repetition, and emotional pain gains more space than novelties. A practical way to break this is to create intentional events on the agenda. It can be joining a face-to-face course, participating in thematic meetings, or starting a collective project. Don't wait for life to happen. Provoke experiences that stimulate gradual vulnerability and expand self-knowledge. Because when you change your experiences, you also change the way you feel about time itself. And that sets up the next important contrast. Not all loneliness is the same, and understanding this changes everything. The invisible loneliness that is born of rejection and social isolation hurts, drains energy, and feeds emotional pain. The chosen solitude, on the other hand, can be a space for internal reorganization, a strategic time for self-knowledge and emotional strengthening. The difference is in the intention and in the consciousness. When the person withdraws out of self-protection, trying to avoid new frustrations, the experience tends to harden the heart. But when she chooses moments of recollection to reflect, read, reorganize goals, or strengthen her own identity, this silence becomes fertile. It's like the difference between hiding and preparing. A simple exercise is to ask, am I drifting away out of fear or growth? Using periods of solitude to develop skills, practice vulnerability with oneself, and revise beliefs about belonging turns isolation into a strategy. Because the way you live your own company defines whether it will be prison or bridge to something bigger. When social isolation goes on for years, it begins to rewrite the story you tell about yourself. The person stops thinking I went through rejection and starts to conclude I am rejectable. This silent distortion feeds invisible loneliness and deepens emotional pain, as if it were an absolute truth. The problem is that the brain confirms what it believes. Social hypervigilance selects only signals that reinforce the feeling of not belonging. A detail becomes proof, an episode becomes standard. And so, identity is shaped more by wounds than by actual experiences of human connection that also existed but were ignored. Rebuilding this self-concept requires intentional practice of self-knowledge. One strategy is to list hard evidence that contradicts the negative narrative: people who have already shown care, moments of acceptance, environments where you felt comfortable. This begins to weaken the cycle of learned helplessness and makes room for a healthier inner reconstruction. And the next step is even more decisive. After so long in social isolation, trusting again seems risky. The mind remembers the old rejections, social hypervigilance tries to protect you, and self-protection whispers, don't expose yourself. But rebuilding human connection doesn't require big leaps, it requires consistent small steps. Confidence is not born from motivational speeches, it is born from repeated experiences. A short coffee, an honest conversation, a group with a common interest. By practicing vulnerability in safe doses, you teach the brain that not every approach results in emotional pain. Gradually, the sense of belonging begins to rebuild. A practical tip is to set simple, measurable social goals, such as starting a new conversation each week or attending a meetup each month. Recording these experiences strengthens self-knowledge and weakens learned helplessness. And when confidence starts to come back, something surprising happens inside you, setting the stage for a larger transformation. There is a silent turn that few people notice. The invisible loneliness that once seemed like punishment can become preparation. When you use this period to develop self-knowledge, strengthen values, and understand your own wounds, social isolation is no longer just absence, it becomes polishing. the emotional pain that was once born of rejection can turn into relational maturity. You begin to recognize patterns, decrease social hypervigilance, and use vulnerability consciously, not as impulsive exposure. Self-protection is no longer a wall and becomes a healthy filter, allowing only aligned connections. At this point, the desire for human connection is no longer lack, it is choice. The sense of belonging arises from the inside out, and this completely changes the quality of the relationships you attract. Emotional healing does not mean never feeling loneliness again, but rather no longer being governed by it, and this transformation makes room for a new chapter. If you've made it this far, you may have recognized yourself in more parts of this journey than you'd like. Perhaps you have realized that invisible loneliness is not a defect of yours, but a learned response to experiences of rejection and emotional pain. And the question that remains is not why did this happen to me? But what am I going to do with it now? Will you continue to let self-protection decide your steps, or will you start, albeit fearfully, to practice small doses of vulnerability and rebuild your human connection? Social isolation may have shaped his story so far, but he doesn't need to write his next chapters. The sense of belonging begins when you decide to act differently. So I ask you, what will be your first small act of courage? A message sent, an invitation accepted, a new environment explored. True emotional healing doesn't happen all at once. It starts with simple, consistent decisions. If this content made sense to you, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep following, because understanding one's own mind is the first step to transforming one's life.